Excellent. It is 10 o'clock, so we'll get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us on this webinar Wednesday. My name is Sharon, and I'm with SIPA, your Colorado government authority, helping you get more information and services online. In today's webinar, we will learn about making accessibility business as usual so you can meet and exceed accessibility standards from Virginia Booth, Matt Leahy, and co-Sherrod at CapTech. Before we get started, please go ahead and turn on captioning if you need or desire, and note that during this webinar, you are muted. If you have questions or would like to communicate with presenters at any point during the webinar, please use the chat box or the Q&A feature. We'll unmute everyone at the end for any remaining questions. We'll also have some poll questions for you to answer during the presentation and a post-webinar survey, and we deeply appreciate your feedback. Please join me in welcoming the team from CapTech Consulting. We appreciate their time and look forward to what they have to share. Also on the call is SIPA's Sales and Marketing Director, Beth Justice, Customer Success Director, Dwayne Tucker, Sales Operations Manager, Heather Nelson, Operations Assistant, Sarah Fisher, and maybe even our new DGS Grant Program Director, Noah Kaplan, if you have any questions for us. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Co and the team at CapTech.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all for being here today. My name is co-Sherrod, and I'm with CapTech Consulting. We're very excited to be here today, and I want to thank our friends with Colorado SIPA for providing us this stage to talk about something that we're very passionate about, making accessibility business as usual. We want to help through this presentation. We hope to help you better understand and feel confident and prepared to meet and exceed accessibility standards in a way that has the greatest impact on your organization and the citizens and stakeholders that you served. Ultimately, that is also sustainable for your organization. Very quickly, we're going to introduce our team here today. Like I said, my name is co-Sherrod. I am CapTech's Public Services Delivery Lead here in the Mountain West. I'm based out of Denver here. While I don't consider myself an accessibility expert, I will share maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I led a complex, impactful engagement that affected a very broad user base of varying skills and abilities. And it really opened my eyes to the impact and the value that inclusive design has on the citizens that we were building for. So since then, this has been a particular topic of interest for me. And that's why I feel especially privileged to be joined today with 2 amazing leaders of CapTech's accessibility practice. Virginia.
Thanks, Co. My name is Virginia Booth. I'm a technical director of user experience at CapTech with a specialty and passion for accessibility. I have nearly 15 years of experience in UX across multiple industries, including financial services, retail, and healthcare. One of the reasons that I love accessibility is because I feel like it's a way that I can help to make the web a better place. And so I make sure to incorporate accessibility into each step of my team's processes from design through development. And I'll hand it over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Virginia. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Leahy. I'm an associate director here with CapTech, specializing in inclusive design and accessibility. I've got over 10 years of experience in a variety of areas in the UX space, including design, front-end development, and of course, accessibility. I really enjoy kind of working across teams to ensure that we're creating the most inclusive outcomes possible. And really excited to be here with you all today and get going.
Great. So very quickly, I'm going to just provide some context about us and about CapTech. We are a full services, technology, business, and creative services consulting firm, partnering with both public and private sector. We provide comprehensive design and development services with a specialization in digital accessibility. So when we engage on a project involving accessibility, whether that's design and development of a new application or website, or specifically accessibility assessments and remediation, we're not only bringing deep accessibility subject matter expertise, but also comprehensive capability in user experience, visual design, web and app development, data visualization, organizational change management, and more. Our goal is always to be a good partner to you. We want to bring our broad expertise to each of those partnerships and help you on your accessibility journey, ultimately setting you up for long-term technology sustainability, value, and success, both your organization and the citizens that you serve. So that's very briefly about CapTech, and with that, I will hand it over to Matt to get into the fun stuff.
Sounds good. Thank you, Co. So I want to quickly cover the agenda for today. We've broken the talk into 4 sections. We're going to start by hitting on some core accessibility concepts and address why this is such an important consideration for all of us and our teams. And then we're going to talk about some things that you can start doing right away to begin embedding accessibility in your organization and begin preparing your teams. After that, we'll talk about some important best practices to keep in mind when you are ready to start making some of those bigger changes to ensure that accessibility can be integrated as smoothly and seamlessly as possible. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to maintain that level of accessibility and continue to improve your accessibility standards as an organization. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's start by level setting on what we mean by accessibility and why it's so important. So I know I personally haven't encountered many people at all that wake up and say, you know, I want to exclude some people from being able to interact with my site today. How can I do that? You know, people don't generally do that, but it's important to remember that if you aren't intentionally thinking about how to make your experience more inclusive, you may be unintentionally excluding users. Accessibility really takes true intention and a lot of proactive thought to ensure that all people can participate in the experiences you offer. The Center for Disease Control reports that 26% of the United States adult population self-reports that they have a disability. And WebAIM, which is part of the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University, reports that nearly 9% of the population has a disability that specifically affects computer use. And that's only individuals that self-identify as someone with a disability. It probably doesn't include much of the older population who have lost some of their abilities with age, and it doesn't account for the situational or temporary disabilities that can affect all of us at various points. For example, an injury that puts your dominant arm in a cast or an operation that impacts your eyesight for a period of time. The truth is that building for accessibility really maximizes access for everyone. And not only do accessible experiences benefit those with disabilities, but they've proven time and time again to benefit a much larger audience. In fact, this has happened so often that there's a name given to this phenomenon, the curb cut effect. The term curb cut effect refers specifically to those sloping ramps that connect the curb to the street below. These were first introduced in the 1940s to allow wheelchair users greater access to sidewalks. But what was interesting is that the curb cuts ended up not just helping those in wheelchairs, but many, many other groups as well. If you've ever pulled a rolling suitcase, pushed a stroller, or rollerbladed, you've probably benefited from a curb cut without even really giving it much thought. From the digital space, another great example is the audiobook. These were first invented for blind readers, but audiobooks today are enjoyed by many sighted audiences as well. I know I do most of my reading these days as a busy dad through audiobooks rather than physical books. So really the takeaway here is when you address the needs of one group and think about how to really maximize the quality of that experience, it has big potential to benefit a much larger audience. And it's a really impactful ripple effect of an inclusive approach. But beyond improving the experience for users, accessibility really does have some other important benefits for government entities. First, it supports SEO best practices. Search engines like Google move through and interact with the internet very much like assistive technology, like screen readers. Google can't see, it can't hear, it can't use a mouse. So it relies on a website to be built and labeled in a way that the content can be programmatically understood and indexed, very much like assistive technology. Being accessible is also an important part of being compliant. HB 21-1110 sets an explicit legal expectation that all Colorado government digital experiences are WCAG 2.1 AA conformant. There's also Section 508 that applies to any programs or activities funded by federal agencies, which states that they must be WCAG 2.0 AA conformant. And of course, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act also applies to state and local government agencies. As a direct result of that, accessibility reduces legal risk. Usable.net tells us that more than 4,600 digital accessibility lawsuits were filed in 2023 across state and federal courts. And we want to call out that if you've heard that adding an accessibility widget or overlay to your site can be a kind of a foolproof fix to protect you from legal action, be aware many of these lawsuits specifically called out those widgets and overlays as a barrier to accessibility. So this is definitely not a solution. So then how do we measure the accessibility of a digital experience? Let's put a quick poll question out there to the group, and then we'll answer that question. So the way we measure accessibility is through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are given to us by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide standards that we can use to design and test for accessibility. Almost all web accessibility litigation relies on WCAG to gauge accessibility conformance, and this is recognized both in the United States and across the world as the go-to standard for accessibility. WCAG, as it's known for short, is a list of guidelines that is constantly being reviewed, studied, and updated to provide the most up-to-date guidance on measures we can take to ensure that our digital experiences are usable by those who may be accessing those experiences in a variety of different ways. And they're organized into 4 concepts. Perceivable, ensuring that content is perceivable to a variety of senses, including sight, hearing, and touch. Operable, which basically says that interface form controls and navigation are operable through different modalities, for example, mouse, touch, keyboard, or voice commands. Understandable, that information and functionality is as understandable as possible to the widest range of users. And robust, which means essentially that the way that the content and the experience is programmed is as robust and compatible with user agents and assistive technologies like screen readers as possible. WCAG has 3 levels of conformance that each criterion is assigned to. A is the lowest level, then there's AA, and AAA is the most stringent standard. And over the years, the guidelines are updated regularly to keep up with changes to technology and user behavior. We just had a change very, very recently in October of 2023 when the current standard was updated to WCAG 2.2. Now, most legal mandates will point to the AA level as the minimum level that has to be met to ensure that an experience is sufficiently accessible to a wider audience. But the required version may vary. We talked earlier about Section 508 versus the HB 21 standard. At CapTech, we strive for conformance with the latest published standard, which is WCAG 2.2 AA in all of our project work. And just note that version 2.2 is inclusive of all of the criteria in 2.1 and 2.0, with one exception, and then added about 9 additional criteria to that as well.
All right, well, that seems a bit complicated, perhaps. Producing accessible experiences can seem daunting, but the hardest part is getting started. And so what we want to talk to you all about today is how we can start embedding accessibility into your process and standard, so you can not only decrease surprises and unexpected work, but create richer experiences that truly provide greater access for a wider range of the citizens that you're serving. So let's get into some of those tactical ways that you can start adopting to raise the bar and make accessibility business as usual in your organization. So what you can do now, first thing you can do is start with your goal when it comes to accessibility, and then make sure that you share it with others for that accountability and awareness. You want to make sure that you understand your current state. So in order to figure out how to reach your goals, you're going to need to know where you're starting from in the first place. A third thing that you can start doing today is setting your team up for success with training and resources. And while you may eventually need to redesign and redevelop your site, a fourth thing that you can start doing today is adopting best practices whenever you're creating and publishing new content. So let's talk a little bit more about setting a goal. Think about all of the different functions and teams that are in your organization today and pull together representatives from each of those areas to participate in defining your accessibility target. So everyone across your organization is aligned with where you're trying to go. You'll need to do some research to understand what laws and regulations apply to your space and what the requirements are to comply with them. For HB 211110, as we know, that's WCAG 2.1 AA by July of this year. Though at CapTech here, we'd recommend actually shooting for 2.2 AA. As Matt mentioned, there are only a few additional criteria that were added as part of the 2.2 update. So ultimately, it will better set you up for success in the future and have minimal, if any, impact to the time or budget needed to reach that 2.1 conformance in the first place. So might as well go ahead and incorporate 2.2 as your goal. You'll want to determine who will be responsible and accountable for driving and maintaining your accessibility targets, and think about what support they'll need in order to be successful. It's unlikely that your existing experiences will become WCAG conformant overnight. So think about what is feasible to accomplish in, let's say, the next quarter, the next 6 months, the next year, perhaps even the next few years, and document those as milestones that you'll continue to work towards. And then finally, we want to make sure to communicate this out to our organizations. We recommend formalizing it with an accessibility commitment or policy that outlines your goal, approach, timing, and who to contact for more information or to report issues or seek assistance. Like I mentioned before, in order to map a path to the future, we'll need to know where we're starting from in the first place. And to do this, you'll want to complete a comprehensive audit of your site. We recommend identifying a trained partner in accessibility to help complete this audit. You'll want to start by defining a representative sample of pages on your site that include any functional components such as buttons, sliders, forms, as well as any of the content types that are presented, such as copy, images, video, or documents. Your testing plan will include a combination of both automated and manual tests as you're performing that audit. When we say automated tests, that's about what you might guess. There are tools out there that can scan your experience and return potential accessibility issues. And there are a lot of different automated testing tools out there, including SiteImprove, which I hear is provided for free to state agencies by OIT, which is awesome, and you should definitely be taking advantage of that. There are some other automated tools that we often use as part of our accessibility audits and assessments. Those are browser plugins, Axe by DQ or Wave by WebAIM. And both Axe and Wave offer a free version. So if you've never played around with an automated test before, I recommend that you download one of those plugins and run a quick scan on one of the pages on your site just to see what that experience is like. However, when it comes to automated tests, there are different stats on what percentage of barriers they can detect. The general consensus is up to 50%. So while they're a really great starting point to understand your site's conformance with WCAG and identify some of those general accessibility issues, you want to make sure not to use automated tools alone. So in order to really get that comprehensive understanding of your site, you'll want to pair those automated tests with some manual tests. Manual tests can include activities such as navigating your site via keyboard only, that is without the use of a mouse, navigating using a screen reader or other assistive technology, zooming to assess the content reflow, reviewing media such as videos for appropriate transcripts and captioning, and reviewing any of the documents that are hosted on your site. Your accessibility partner should take the results of all of these different automated and manual tests and compile them into one report, including notes on the severity of the issues that have been identified, the WCAG criteria that they map up to, and suggestions on how to remediate them. The tests that we were just talking about are also the basis for the accessibility conformance reporting, which you should expect and request from any vendors who are supplying plugins or tools or anything else like that on your site. This is important because you're actually liable for the accessibility of any of the experiences on your site, even if they are provided by a third party. So you'll want to make sure that you understand where your third-party partners stand with their current accessibility and what their plans are if they don't currently meet your standards. As part of this effort, you'll also want to check any of the contracts that you have with these folks to make sure that you have included accessible outcomes within that documentation. And if they aren't in there today, then make a note to add those expectations to any future contracts. Once you have this understanding of your current state, you can publish an accessibility statement on your site. And even if you're just getting started in this space, publishing an accessibility statement is critical to establishing that transparency and accountability to follow through on the accessibility commitments that we were just talking about. Your statement might be very simple at first, but you can add more detail as you learn and incorporate more into your accessibility standards. But make sure that at a minimum, it includes an outline of the current level of accessibility and WCAG conformance that your site meets. Inform users about the measures that you're taking to monitor and improve the accessibility, and provide contact information for reporting accessibility issues or seeking assistance. All right, now let's talk about setting your team up for success with training and resources. Think about all the different roles on your team that support your site or contribute content and what they might need to know about. And I see the poll just launched there coming in, asking about the different roles that are on your team today. The great news is that there are a lot of great and free digital accessibility resources out there, including on Colorado's OIT site, which is pictured in a screenshot here on the slide. You'll want to make sure to start with training on core concepts for really everyone in your organization. Make sure they understand those fundamentals of accessibility. We often say that everyone has a part to play in delivering an accessible experience, and so that means that everyone should have a baseline understanding of what that entails and what we mean when we say that. You'll also want to consider role-specific training for anyone who is part of building or maintaining your site. One way that we do this within our own teams and recommend to others as well is to review the types of issues that appear in accessibility testing reports and identify potential gaps in your team's skill set where you can provide some targeted resources or training for folks. A couple of great resources where you can look for materials include, again, Colorado's OIT Guide to Accessible Web Services. There's also the W3C that has a Web Accessibility Initiative Fundamentals. And as you might recall, this is the same organization who publishes the WCAG criteria. So definitely a reputable source there. We are also big fans of WebAIM that Matt mentioned earlier. So webaim.org has a number of resources. And then DQ has a DQ University's on-demand courses, which have a lot of great content as well. All right, so let's take a look at the poll here. It looks like most folks have content authors on their teams. So in that case, like as I mentioned before, that accessibility fundamentals is something that we would recommend for all of your team members, but specifically for content authors, some additional resources that you should look into include any training on creating accessible content or accessible documents. And they also might find that resources on designing for accessibility are also really relevant to the work that they're doing. All right, another thing that you can start doing today, armed with all of your new training, is adopting best practices when creating new content for your site. And so great, again, to hear that there's so many content authors represented on your teams. So even if the design and code of your site is perfectly executed, the overall accessibility of the experience will still depend on your content following some important best practices. So we recommend some training as well as perhaps a checklist to ensure that your content authors are set up for success in using and applying these standards to their work. The sooner that you adopt them, the better you'll be positioned to maintain accessibility as your website grows. And so we've selected 7 best practices for content authors that we think are very impactful. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, but definitely a good starting point. You want to make sure that you're always defining alternate text on informative images that describe the purpose or content of the page. You want to avoid images of text wherever possible. Make sure that you're including captions, transcripts, and audio descriptions as needed for all audio or video content. Make sure that you're writing page titles, headings, and link text to be unique and informative. Use headings, lists, and tables for their intended purpose only. This one is really important. We have seen many times when folks are leveraging different heading styles or tables to drive the way that content is presented on the page, but without any real functional reason to do so. And this can be really confusing and even difficult to navigate for users of assistive technology. And so we want to make sure that we are using those elements appropriately, driven by the needs of the content and not the visual display that we want on the page. We want to make sure that we are writing in simple, plain language. Aim for 9th grade reading level or below, and make sure that you're avoiding any unfamiliar terms, not using acronyms without defining them, and avoid figurative language that might not be understandable to everyone in your audience. And finally, you want to avoid using sensory cues in your copy. So for example, if there was some direction that said required fields are colored in red. If I'm a user who can't distinguish the color red from other colors on your site, that's not going to be very helpful for me. If you want to learn more about any of these best practices or find a checklist to provide to your team, you can either reference any of the resources that we mentioned earlier, and we can share out those links. Or just doing a quick search, you'll be able to find plenty of helpful material. And now with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Matt to share some things that you can start doing soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Virginia. I just want to make a quick mention. I did see one hand raised. If you could just put your question in the Q&A panel, perhaps we're going to carve out a few minutes at the end for questions. All right, so let's jump in here. So when you are able to start making more significant updates and perhaps start updating the design and coding of your website, accounting for accessibility from the beginning and throughout the process can greatly reduce the number of issues that you encounter and the rework that you have to deal with later on. In addition, establishing these standards now is going to help you more easily meet accessibility standards on any future projects that you have. So we want to hit on 3 points here. First is that accessibility should be incorporated into the earliest stages of the design process. Second, we want to make sure that any development requirements that you're working against have accessibility represented. And third, you want to make sure that you're considering accessibility when you're evaluating technology partners. So I want to start by calling out an important consideration to be aware of, and that is that there are some WCAG criteria that can be remediated relatively easily after development. For example, adding alternate text on an image or a label on a field. Those things can be done relatively easily at any time. But there are other WCAG criteria that fundamentally impact the design and the user experience in ways that can be a lot more disruptive to address later on. And in newer versions of WCAG, we're seeing more and more of these types of criteria. So just a few examples for you to be aware of. First is the use of color. WCAG requires that, of course, text, but also important graphics and interactive elements have strong color contrast, and that color isn't used alone to convey meaning without labeling or other visual indicators. Virginia mentioned the example just a minute ago of required fields being colored in red. We see this violation a lot in addition when it comes to charts and graphs and other data visualizations where maybe color coding is used to identify data points. And then in navigational menus where maybe a color change is the only visual indication of which item is currently selected. Considerations like these are most effectively and painlessly addressed in the design phase because they could have big cascading effects on other aspects of the site design and color palette if you have to address them later on down the line. Next, to be conformant, you have to ensure that interactive elements on your site allow for multiple modes of operation. Really common violations here are content that's displayed only on hover with a mouse, or features that rely exclusively on drag and drop functionality. Both of those would violate WCAG and also exclude users who aren't using a mouse to interact. It's important to consider these sorts of things up front as well, because they could require some fundamental rethinking of how certain features are designed. You certainly don't want to have to go back to the drawing board on those sorts of things late in the game. They could also potentially require reevaluating which third-party plugins you're using on your site if those plugins are actually providing some of that functionality. And again, that's a change better to make early than later on in the game. And the last example here is your navigation and help mechanisms. WCAG has some specific criteria that primary navigation elements and help mechanisms on your site appear in a consistent order and location across the experience. And that's to ensure predictability for your users and an intuitive navigation experience. Again, if you don't plan for these sorts of requirements up front, it could result in significant rework to your page templates or the overall navigational structure of your site. So how can we get ahead of these sorts of issues and also ensure that accessibility is achieved as efficiently and effectively as possible with the best end product? Well, the first part of that answer is to incorporate accessibility considerations into the earliest stages of the design process. So let's talk about a few ways to do that. First, a lot of accessibility requirements, color contrast, text formatting, touch target size, for example, have measurable standards that we can check against. And many design applications, most notably Figma, which is the current industry standard for UI design work, now offer plugins that allow designers to evaluate these criteria directly in their design files. And if we can have our designers proactively checking for those requirements at that early stage, when we're just pushing pixels in our design software, we can avoid needing to fix those issues and alter designs later on when things are much more built out. In addition, if you can provide documentation and resources for your designers and content authors, that can be a big benefit as well. Most useful are perhaps checklists. The WCAG documentation can be very dense and technical and perhaps overwhelming, but a checklist that distills those WCAG requirements down into simple and actionable points for your designers and content authors can be really helpful, and just and if that can be incorporated into your regular process, can also help ensure that accessibility is just a top of mind consideration at all times. There are a lot of checklists like this readily available with a quick Google search, and then Virginia mentioned earlier, we can share out some resources as well after the presentation today. Perhaps the most important and far-reaching in its impact is to make sure that you're considering different user abilities and types of input or operation as you're designing. It's a natural tendency for us to think primarily about our own experiences and our own preferences when we're designing, but it's important to remember that not every user has the same abilities or uses the mouse as their primary means of navigating a website. So when we're considering any new design, any new interaction that we're planning, it's important to always consider the different ways that a user may interact, which could be a mouse, but it could also be touch, keyboard, voice commands, a screen reader perhaps. And we want to ensure that the experience is equally as effective, efficient, and intuitive for all of those different scenarios. In our experience, this typically doesn't require major changes most of the time, but rather just small adjustments that can have big impact on your user base. And finally, you always want to strive for the highest standard of usability, which is something that WCAG hasn't always addressed, but is starting to do so a lot more in more recent versions. At the end of the day, that's really the point of all of this work, is to ensure that our digital experiences are as usable as possible. But again, just like with the previous point, we need to consider users other than ourselves. We tend to make a lot of assumptions about what's intuitive, what's understandable, and so on. But it's important to question those assumptions and remember that users can vary widely in key cognitive functions like reading and comprehension, processing speed, and memory. And especially in public services, we want to keep that diversity of our user base in mind. So very much along the same lines, addressing accessibility considerations proactively during initial development can greatly mitigate the number of issues that we have to identify and correct later on, when we get to actually testing and auditing for accessibility. It's always easier and faster to do it right the first time than to correct it later, I think is the key theme here. So the first part of the process to consider is that handoff from design to development. Visual designs typically do a pretty good job of representing the experience for a fully sighted user who's interacting with a pointer like a mouse or touch, but not so much for other types of users, like those who are relying on assistive technology and whose experience is driven a lot more by the underlying code than it is by the visual design. But that doesn't mean designers shouldn't still be considering those users. They absolutely should. And one of the tools that they can employ to do that is to incorporate annotations into their designs to relay important accessibility considerations to their developers. These annotations can remove guesswork, ensure that accessibility requirements are being addressed upfront as proactively as possible, and then as a result, prevent accessibility issues that have to be corrected later on. For designers that are new to this process, we recommend starting simple and tackling some basic considerations like alternate text for images, maybe landmark regions on your page, and heading levels. And as you gain comfort, you can sort of add to the robustness of the annotations that you're providing to your developers. Next, acceptance criteria. So in many development workflows, acceptance criteria are written for development teams to reference, and they essentially describe what a correct implementation of a certain feature should look like. Accessibility considerations should always be included alongside other functional criteria to make sure that developers are always considering accessibility in their work. These accessibility criteria are going to vary, depending on the feature and the particular experience, but in general, they'll address things like keyboard operability, focus order, and accessible labeling. Lastly, just like we would never publish new content or features on our sites without performing basic quality assurance testing, we should never be making significant website updates without some standard accessibility testing being performed. This should include, like Virginia mentioned earlier, some basic manual testing to complement the functional QA that's already being performed, which might include testing functionality with a keyboard as well as a mouse, running through the interactions with a screen reader, or testing zooming and text resizing. And automated testing can be leveraged here as well. This can, of course, be done with simple browser plugins like Axe DevTools or Wave, which we've mentioned, or in more sophisticated development environments and workflows. There's the possibility to incorporate automated accessibility checks into those development workflows to provide immediate feedback and checks for developers. All right, and then the last consideration that I want to hit on here is selecting the right technology partners. So we're going to put another quick poll question out there. Thank you. So while you all are answering that, I'll cover a little bit of the content here. So most websites, and this is, I'm sure, true of most of your websites as well, are maintained through a content management system or a CMS. And they probably include content or functionality that is supplied by third parties through plugins, embeds, media players, or other integrations like that. And regardless of the accessibility of the rest of your website, if these third-party tools don't meet standards, you can still ultimately end up with an experience that's inaccessible for many users. And it can be pretty challenging, costly, and time-consuming to replace a piece of technology that's really fundamentally integrated into your overall website experience. So for those of you who answered no to the poll question, here are a few steps you can take to evaluate technology vendors in the future. First, look on their website or perhaps in your contract for documentation of their accessibility support. Chances are, if they're doing it right and accessibility is a consideration for that vendor, they will be proactive and transparent about providing that. But if you can't, if you don't see that accessibility documentation, you can request an accessibility conformance report from that vendor, or ACR is the abbreviation. And you'll most often see those in the voluntary product accessibility template format. You'll encounter some other formats as well, but that VPAT format is going to be the most common. Accessibility conformance reports can be pretty dense and perhaps a bit overwhelming if you haven't seen one before. We've got a screenshot of one on the slide here that shows WCAG criteria listed down the left column, a conformance level with values like supports, does not support, and not applicable in the middle column, and then some remarks and notes in the right column, just explaining how that particular experience measures up to those criteria. So the ACR should cover those basic data points. But if you if you have questions about any of that, we'll provide some resources after the presentation here as well. Now, in addition to that ACR, if you're able to, and you have this capability within your team, you can also perform your own accessibility assessment of the technology to see whether it meets your standards, following some of the same basic testing methods that we've talked about previously in the presentation here. And the last thing I want to note while we're talking about technology partners is specific to CMS solutions. So the W3C, the same organization that provides the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also publishes a set of standards for authoring tools called the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. And so for your CMS vendors, you can also inquire whether the platform meets those authoring tool accessibility guidelines. And those authoring tool accessibility guidelines will provide, just like WCAG does, guidelines for the actual accessibility of the authoring tool experience itself, but also guidelines for how authoring tools should support the production and output of accessible content on your website. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Virginia to talk about how we can keep it going.
All right, thanks, Matt. So let's jump into our last section here and talk about ways that we can continue to support and expand on the accessibility of our experiences. So accessibility is not a one and done activity. Even after you get your website to a point of compliance, you'll want to continue to monitor and make sure that any updates that are made still are aligned with your standards, and look for opportunities to continue to increase the quality and inclusivity of your experiences. And some of the ways that we can keep improving and expanding the accessibility of our sites include remembering that it's more than just guidelines, assessing your site on a regular basis, and seeking input from users with disabilities. WCAG conformance is not a comprehensive measure of accessibility. It certainly is a great starting point and covers a lot of really important ways in which we can make sure that our content is available and usable by the largest number of folks as possible. But there are a lot of accessibility considerations that have a real impact on users that aren't currently represented within that criteria. So we encourage you to continue to push beyond just baseline WCAG requirements and explore additional accessibility and usability best practices that you can implement on your site. This will not only better position you to meet new requirements as they're published, you'll also create a just more richly accessible experience for all of your citizens. In fact, the last few times that WCAG has been updated, most of the new criteria have actually just been formalizing best practices that were already well known. A couple of examples that came out with the 2.2 editions include new criteria around dragging movements. This criteria restricts functionality that relies on pointer-based dragging motions alone, which is a known challenge for users with limited motor control. Another example is the minimum target size criteria. This was already included on within the 2.1 guidelines as a AAA criterion, but it was moved to AA status with 2.2. This one was really a long time coming. Apple and others have for many years had best practices around making sure that we have the right touch target size, so minimum size and spacing for any of our interactive elements. And then a third example here is the new accessible authentication criterion, which limits the use of cognitive function tests like solving a puzzle or transcribing a code. I know we all have probably had some fun with CAPTCHA over the years that are often used as part of authentication flows. And this criteria really formalized a lot of the established best practices for designing for cognitive disabilities. So if you're thinking about usability, if you're thinking about accessibility beyond and really think about that umbrella of usability overall, you're going to be setting yourself up for success. When you're first starting out, it's likely that your accessibility audit will result in a number of items that need to be remediated in order to meet that baseline compliance level. And depending on the state of your site, this might not be the most fun experience. However, once you have established that strong foundation and you're incorporating content author best practices into your ways of working and thinking about accessibility up front whenever you have larger changes to your site, subsequent reviews should be much less eventful. If you're ensuring that all of those updates made to your site have appropriate accessibility checks up front, you'll be able to catch those issues quickly and make smaller adjustments to course correct as needed. In between those big, larger site updates that you might be planning, you can use a monitoring tool like Google Lighthouse, Axe Monitor, or again, Site Improve to identify issues as they arise. We also recommend that at least once a year, you perform a site-wide accessibility check to ensure your holistic experience still meets your accessibility targets. This is also a great trigger to update the accessibility statement published on your site to reflect your current status. There's a famous phrase that's often quoted when we're referencing digital disability rights that says, "Nothing about us without us." And this absolutely applies to digital accessibility. While accessibility efforts rely heavily on standards like WCAG, at the end of the day, it's really about the people, the real people, the people that your agency serves and how they are able to interact with your experiences and participate in your programs. So here are 3 ways that you can start to seek input from users with disabilities. The first is to provide a prominent and accessible place on your website, separate of general website feedback or contact requests where users can report any accessibility issues that they run into or request accessibility related support. Be sure to monitor and reply to these requests promptly. And if they uncover gaps in the usability of your site, you can use that to help inform your accessibility roadmap. Next, we recommend that you include users with disabilities in any research and testing that you do on your site. The only guaranteed way to know how a new design will work for users with physical, sensory, or cognitive disabilities is to hear directly from them as they interact with your designs or with your site. You can recruit participants with disabilities by contacting organizations in your area that serve these communities. For example, the Colorado Center for the Blind, or use a recruitment tool like Fable, which specializes in accessibility testing powered by people with disabilities. The best way, though, to create truly inclusive experiences is to include individuals with lived experience on your team from the very beginning. Bring them in as active participants on your team in the design and development process. This might take a while to achieve, but you can take the first step towards working to improve the accessibility of your workplace to accommodate a more diverse team. All right, we covered a lot of ground there today, so let's recap and wrap it up. As we've been talking about, accessibility should be approached as more than just a requirement to check some items off of a list, although those checklists are very helpful. It should be fully and enthusiastically incorporated into your organization's ways of working and business as usual, and part of your definition of what good quality work entails. Like addressing any bugs, the longer you wait, the more expensive and time consuming it will likely be to remediate issues. So we encourage you to start now. Lay the foundation for bigger improvements by setting a goal, understand your current state, set your team up for success with training and resources, and adopt best practices when creating new content. The next time that you're embarking on a larger site design project, lay an accessibility foundation in your experience design, incorporate it into the design and development process, and consider it whenever you're selecting new technology. And then continue to raise the bar. So remember that the audience that you're serving is really what we're talking about, the reason why we're here, the reason why this is important, and strive to continue to make that experience better for them by opening yourself up to feedback and including users with different abilities into your design process. Whether you're kicking off a new website build or even uploading minutes from a quarterly meeting, the best time to start incorporating accessibility into your process is right now. So I'm going to hand it over to Co to share a few ways that CapTech would love to partner with you and your agencies on your accessibility journey. Co?
Yeah, thanks. So finally, just circling back on to how we might help you. There aren't any secrets to this, or if they are, we just shared them and they'll be available on YouTube at the end of the week. Accessibility is a passion for our team. So whether you need help in design, development, testing, training, we want to help you ensure that your digital experiences are usable to everyone across the wide spectrum of physical, cognitive, and sensory abilities. We have accessible design and development services. We can support operations and training of your teams. We can perform accessibility audits and remediation. But where I believe our team really provides the greatest value is in being a coach. You may have what seems like a very challenging objective, tight timeline. It's hard to know where to start and maybe what truly is accomplishable. But we can help you demystify that. We can help you make it understandable, help define your focus on what's most important right now and gives you the biggest impact for your dollar. Build a roadmap based on your priorities and your constraints. And help you on your journey to make accessibility business as usual in your organization. I hope it came across. We love talking about this. We take great value in being a part of this community and welcome the opportunity to talk further, have a meeting, answer a question if we can help. I know our contact information is on the next slide. Our SIPA friends always know how to find us. And we're happy to take some questions.
All right, I'm working on getting everyone unmuted, but if you want to, you're welcome to throw something in the chat. I know we have a few questions also in the Q&A already queued up to go.
Excellent.
Maybe we start with Mark Maloney's question. I hope the content Virginia covered started to answer this question, but I'll reiterate a little bit of what Virginia mentioned and just build on that as well. Mark, you're exactly right. The spectrum of ability is very complex and multifaceted. And
Matt, can you read the question first?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Apologies. So Mark said, my new knowledge on disabilities is the type of disabilities is unlimited and the usability perspective is unlimited too. When defining accessibility requirements, how far do you go? Like you're saying, Mark's exactly right. It's a very wide and nuanced spectrum, and there's a very wide range of experiences, and it's truly different for everybody. And I think that's why having a tool like WCAG as a starting point is so helpful. There's a ton of research and testing and input that goes into developing the WCAG standard, and it provides a really helpful starting point that even if it doesn't cover all of those nuances and all of those specific cases does cover a really comprehensive set of best practices to provide a really strong foundation. So that's really your starting point. And then to continue to optimize, because like we said, WCAG is not comprehensive and doesn't account for all of those cases. That's where, like Virginia was talking about, you start actually soliciting feedback, you start actually hearing from users, and you can make progressive improvements and optimizations to what you have based on that real user feedback. Virginia, anything you would add to that answer?
I think you covered it.
Right.
Let's see. And I see Michael Lippman asked about, besides uploading the recording to SIPA videos, can we also obtain the slides to search for specific answers using keywords? If you want to reach out to us, our contact information here, if you want to reach out to me, it's vbooth, VBOOTH at captechconsulting.com. And I'd be happy to send you a copy of the slides.
And you had a sheet, I think you mentioned, with resources for everyone. We will
Yes.
throw that up on CapTech's page on our website if you want to find that later on. If you want to send the slides, we can throw those up on there as well, Virginia.
Excellent. There's one in the chat that I'm answering now, and I'll put the answer in the chat as well. But the question was, are all vendors required to provide the ACR service? And it sounds like they're having trouble with their particular service providing that. So vendors are not required to provide accessibility conformance reports. However, we would strongly encourage any organization that is looking to partner with a group that has standards or legal requirements to provide those documents, but they are not required to actually provide an ACR. And then there's a question in the Q&A also, a great one. Does this include social media channels such as Facebook, Instagram, and Nextdoor? When it comes to publishing content on those platforms themselves, we would encourage that you use a lot of the same guidelines, such as ensuring that you have color contrast, using alt text and things like that, so that your posts themselves are accessible as accessible as possible to your end users. When it comes to the functionality of Facebook, Instagram, or Nextdoor in particular, or any social media, if you are embedding a live feed into your website, then you'll want to make sure that that experience that's provided to your users is meeting the WCAG guidelines. However, when it comes to the functionality of actually Facebook.com, let's say when they're on that channel, that would not be your responsibility. Although I would say I would consider that when you're determining the channels that you want to use to publish content. Matt, do you
Brad had a
thoughts on
question.
that?
No, I think that covers it. I was going to try to tackle Brad's question in the last couple of minutes we have here. Brad said, we're just about finished with a comprehensive audit of our website, including testing by people who have disabilities. But our current main area of concern is creating accessible PDFs moving forward. We're a small shop, and consistently paying for remediation for the 2 to 5 documents we create and post each month isn't likely to be feasible. Do you offer specific training workflows to help our team create PDFs that are accessible rather than needing to remediate? It's a great question. PDF remediation is indeed painful. So definitely hear you there, Brad. I think the first thing that I would say is that process can be a lot less painful if you start with the source files. So whether you're creating those PDFs through, a Word document template, PowerPoint template, whatever that might be, most software like that allow you to set up basic, accessibility features like alternate text on images, defining a reading order, setting heading levels, and those sorts of things. And if you can set up really good buttoned up templates, exporting to PDF should carry a lot of that over. You should have a much more accessible starting point, and you really shouldn't need to go through remediation every time you generate new PDFs. Instead, it should hopefully just be a matter of running some quick checks on the PDF after it's been exported.
And Matt, if I could just add, also to directly answer, yes, we provide, we can help with workflows, training, but I just put in a link to the OIT site. OIT does have a site specifically on accessible PDF documents. If you haven't checked it out, they do have some guides and some training. So, we'd love to help you, but we'd also like to enable you, so maybe you don't have to pay for help if you don't need it.
And Greg had his hand raised, but he also put a question in the Q&A. So I don't know if it's the same thing or not. If you want to unmute Greg and ask, or if your questions were good to go.
I did unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, I appreciate you sharing the slide deck. Ironically, I think it might be more accessible, which was the topic. So I thought that was great. Also, are people using any of those WCAG tools as a part of their automated build so that every build checks accessibility instead of having to remediate at the end of a sprint or something?
Absolutely. And we recommend that you incorporate testing within your development process so that you're whenever you're publishing or releasing new features and functionality to your site, that has already been vetted. The one thing I'll say though on that is that if you are releasing components that are used within your experience, it's great to make sure that those components, those puzzle pieces individually are meeting the WCAG standards. But you'll also want to take a look at how those puzzle pieces are fitting together. So a great example is with the heading tags and making sure that you're using H tags appropriately. Within a component, you might have the appropriate structure for the copy within that component, but you'll also want to make sure that you're looking at it within the context that it's being presented on your site. So what is appropriate H-tag wise within that component might not be appropriate in the context of the larger experience, if that makes sense.
It does. And Scott Davis, who does some work with us for the state, came to the Java users group I run and did a talk on this. So it's great that you did this. He also talked about stuff we kind of didn't cover, including like special audio content. If somebody is, visually impaired, or not just visually impaired, but maybe hearing impaired and things like that, where we can make some adjustments for content to best be able to meet the needs of all of our customers, basically. So thank you so much for doing this today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the great questions.
Yes, and hopefully that YouTube video will have captions like it should. We'll see. Anyway, it looks like we have made our time already, so I want to thank you all for sticking with us to the end. That was a wonderful presentation, chock full of information. Thank you, CapTech. All of you guys are amazing, and I am so thankful that you have shared your expertise here with us. If any of you have any questions that come up afterwards, you've got our contact information, so you know how to get hold of any of us. We'd be happy to get back to you. Make sure you go to our website to register for any future webinars we have coming up. On March 27th, we've got Ruben Brown, who will be talking about business improvement, process improvement. April 24th, Optiv is going to be sharing how they can help with cybersecurity. And on May 8th, we've got Evotech on the opportunities and risks of using generative AI in your organization. We've also got other services that we can help you procure, and our monthly newsletter that I put a link in the chat for you can subscribe to. We've got some great announcements coming up for our grant programs that'll be opening up. We've got great resources for you. Anything that we can share, we do. If you want to return to this webinar, as we mentioned, it will be on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of this week. And we've got a short survey that's coming out at the end. And I hope that you can all take a moment to answer those 3 questions and let us know how we can make these even better for you. That's it from us. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us.